This is episode 96 of the Death to Tyrants podcast.
The crushing weight of the tyrant's passage had left nothing unmarked.
You get split in fucking half, like on the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Hey, welcome back, you guys, once again to the Death to Tyrants podcast. As always, I'm still your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Austin, Texas. Today, I want to talk about the neoconservative movement. I don't know, there's not a lot of movements in American political history that have been more destructive than the neoconservatives. And we use the term neocon often as a pejorative, and I think that's as it should be. Sometimes I think it's maybe fired in the wrong direction. Maybe we call some people neocons that aren't true neocons, that don't follow that philosophy. And then there's always where did they come from? Where did this movement spring from? Well, you might have heard over the years at points that they were former Trotskyites and from the Socialist Party in the Soviet Union, and that in reality, they're not conservative at all. And that for the most part, that's very true. I was reading a piece on it, and it's a piece from back in 2015 in Chronicles magazine, and there was a line that caught my eye, and I couldn't let it go. It was very well put, and it was that blanket depictions of neoconservatives as redesigned Trotskyites need to be corrected in favor of a more nuanced analysis. And that piece was written by my guest today, Srdja Trifkovic, and the piece was called Neoconservatism, where Trotsky meets Stalin and Hitler. And that was, like I said, in Chronicles magazine. I'll link to that article in the show notes page for this episode, of course. But man, my guest knows a lot about this stuff. He's got quite the disdain for the neoconservative movement, as he should. And his intro, his bio is so long that I can't even read it all to you. But it's Srdja Trifkovic. I will tell you this. He's been doing stuff for a long time, since I've been alive, basically. He was a broadcaster for the BBC World Service in London, the Voice of America in Washington, D.C. He was a scholar at the Hoover Institute. He was chief of staff at the London office of Crown Prince Alexander I can't even say that last name. I'll say it wrong if I say it at all. He's been foreign affairs editor of Chronicles, a magazine of American culture. He's a professor of international relations at University of Banja Luka. He's done a lot. He's authored many, many books, and he's been traveling a lot. And the day before this interview, he was supposed to be on, and he was not able to attend. He was at a monastery in Montenegro, and go figure, they did not have great Wi-Fi service. And I thought that's one of the most unique reasons why someone's had to postpone an interview I've ever had. But luckily, the next day, we were able to do this, and he finally sat down and discussed all things neoconservatism with me. And I'm happy to have him here today. Srdja Trifkovic, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
Yes, sir. Before we talk about the neoconservative movement, can you talk about where you are and what you do? I know you've been traveling a lot.
At the moment, I'm in the capital of Montenegro, the city of Podgorica. Montenegro is the latest addition to NATO, a former Yugoslav republic, which is right now in the midst of an identity crisis. Because it is originally one of the two Serbian states, Serbia proper and Montenegro, were both considered more or less equally Serbian, except that Montenegro was the warrior, tiny little warrior spot that was never fully conquered by the by the Turks, whereas Serbia was, in fact, under Turkish occupation until the early 19th century. So Montenegrins always had a little bit of local pride in the fact that they were the resilient, tough nut to crack. And their neighbors sometimes joke that the Turks never fully occupied Montenegro because there was nothing worth occupying. Anyway, right now the Montenegrin government wants to take over the property of the Serbian Orthodox Church, which is the traditional, locally established Orthodox Church, and they want to promote a separate Montenegrin church which doesn't exist. And it's only very broadly similar to the Ukrainian situation, because in Ukraine, at least, even the non-canonical Orthodox Church has always had its believers. It had a flock, and it had some priests. In Montenegro, the newly fangled national church has none. So I came here to lecture on the subject last weekend, and here I am again. After that, I will lecture in Banja Luka at the university in Bosnia-Herzegovina on geopolitics and international relations, and then I'll come to the US for a week and fly back 10 days later. So it's pretty dynamic, and on the whole, we live in interesting times, as the old Chinese curse would say.
Yeah, it sounds like it, and lots of traveling by you. So let's get into this neoconservative discussion to lay some factual groundwork, because we hear the term neocon quite often, and I think it probably gets misused from time to time. And I want to get into the history and all of the names and all of that. But before we do that even, can you give a broad or kind of generalized definition of what is meant by the term neocon?
It is a misnomer, because there is nothing authentically conservative in the sense of seeking to preserve something that is deeply rooted, traditional, and spontaneously emerging in their ideology. I think that the term was coined in parallel with the new left that was emerging in Europe in the 1960s. And the focus of the new left was a break with the established forms of boring and outdated dialectical materialism, as well as the dead hand of the Soviet Union, which at that time was stagnating under Leonid Brezhnev. So in the aftermath of the student demonstrations of 1968, the new left in Europe tried to forge a new ideological approach. And one must say that whatever differences between its ideology and that of the Stalinist era, it was still definitely leftist. The new left tried to substitute the capitalist of the old Marxist paradigm with the concept of male European or European origined, i.e. white, heterosexual Christian, as the oppressor figure. And the proletarian, who in the old Marxist paradigm had nothing to lose but his chains, became in the new left paradigm a member of one of the disadvantaged groups. That was the beginning of the cultural Marxism, which has formed in our own time, which has morphed in our own time into all kinds of eccentric and even lunatic branches. The parallel on the right had a somewhat more convoluted path to follow. What is most salient feature of the process is that some people who belonged to the defeated wing of the communist movement in the 40s and the 50s, the Trotskyites, who believed essentially in permanent revolution and who rejected Stalin's notion of socialism in one country, decided that in order to achieve their objectives, which was essentially state control over different aspects of human life, which would be coupled with an essentially, again, egalitarian statism at home and unlimited imperialism abroad, needed a different label, needed a different name. And this was also the period when this neo adjective was rather popular for the ideological ferment of the 1960s, so they could, so to say, cover their tracks. But essentially, what neoconservatism boils down to is state imperialism on steroids. It does not believe, as authentic conservatives do, on spontaneously emerging local communities, which are based on the links of shared cultural and moral and religious values. It is based on a completely synthetic notion of America as a society based on purely ideological premises. And sometimes these ideological premises hark back to the Puritan notions of exceptionalism. Sometimes they're entirely based on the newly fangled notions of one world utopianism. So in the end, the extreme form of neoconservatism, which two prominent authors from that camp, William Crystal and Robert Kagan, called benevolent global hegemony, comes to globalism, which would be very similar both in ideological content and in its de facto manifestations with the neo-Marxist one world globalism of the Gleichschaltung of races and nations and the disappearance of old national identities. So I know this sounds like a very shorthand sketch, almost a caricature, but what we have is neoconservatism as an evolving form of leftist heresy, calling itself right in order to end up again on the left, where the terms left and right become completely meaningless, because what we are dealing with is really the dilemma or the schism between an ideology of genuine conservatism rooted in the constitutional tradition of the United States and in the philosophical tradition of ancient Greece and Rome, of the Athenian polis and the Roman Republic, and on the other hand, quasi-conservatism, which kidnapped the conservative part of neoconservatism, which is really post-national, anti-traditional, and opposed to any form of community based on the shared genes and the shared ancestors, the shared myths and the shared songs.
You mentioned in your article that the Trotskyites actually favored you called it a withering away of the state, and that's obviously kind of a key area where more modern neocons split from that Trotskyite philosophy.
That's right.
And it's much closer really with Stalinism and National Socialism, with a philosophy that says society can be managed by the state politically and economically. Can you talk about that and how that also parts from traditional conservatism?
Well, it parts in a very obvious way, because if we look at the critique of the French Revolution and onwards the critique of the Commune of Paris and of the Bolshevik experiment, it invariably boils down to the monstrous nature of the attempt to build a political system based upon abstractions about human nature, and particularly the pernicious notion that human nature can be changed through education and indoctrination, which was really one of the many bastard children of the era of enlightenment. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau is burning in hell for that. So neoconservatism also has this notion of ersatz patriotism, which is nothing else but artificial and rootless jingoism, which in its essence is globalist in the sense that it doesn't define belonging to a true historical and deeply rooted America at all. It actually celebrates the role of the United States as the leader of the progressive humanity, just as the real Kremlin, not the one on the Potomac, proclaimed itself the leader of the progressive humanity in the 1920s. So if you look at the ideological underpinnings of the conservative global mission, it invariably comes to the human rights, free markets, democracy, and all sorts of abstractions which do not really have anything to do with the specifically American set of beliefs, way of life, or identity. And of course, it's a moot point whether we have passed the hope of recovery of anything authentic that the United States still had in the way of nationhood before the legislation of 1965. But undoubtedly, the neocon Weltanschauung, world outlook, so to say, is not connected to any sense of the continuity of Anglo-Irish or Anglo-Celtic and then European community, which turned the United States into an experiment rooted, amazingly enough, on the blend of Magna Carta and British constitutional tradition on the one hand, and the political thinkers of the ancient world on the other. For the 13 colonies of the second half of the 19th century, it's really pretty amazing to have such a bunch of talented people, well-educated as well as responsible and thoughtful, who were capable of devising this framework for the emerging young nation. Now, the neocons don't feel any kinship with that at all. They actually want America to be this proposition nation, no less than Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama insisted on the US as essentially an ideological construct and not a real country.
Yeah, you actually noted something I thought was a brilliant point in the article. It's that a lot of the neocons really weren't patriotic in the traditional sense. It's that they basically wanted to use the United States as a host organism. And the irony in that, of course, is that a lot of the times the wars are kind of sold to us in a patriotic nature, correct?
Indeed, to them, the boys from the South and the prairies were just cannon fodder. Again, without naming any names, I've seen articles where people have tried to establish whether any of the leading neocon authors' offspring have ever served in the armed forces, let alone died in one of the wars they advocate. On the other hand, among the foreign policy realists who are opposed to neocon global interventionism, you have a prolific author of the highest rank and a quality thinker, Andrew Bacevich, whose son died in Iraq fighting a war he didn't believe in and his father didn't believe in. So this lack of kinship is entirely predictable, because we are talking about people who indeed look upon everything between Manhattan and LA as the flyover country of deplorables, no less than the leftist elite does. The neocon elite is indeed as dependent on state largesse and on the military-industrial complex and on the swamp as their nominal ideological foes. But in the end, and this is no surprise to me, when it comes to specific policies and when it comes to the global grand strategy, they are almost identical. They turn out to be two sides of the same medal. To both the liberal globalist left and the neoconservative quasi-right, the notion of America coming home and being great again by rebuilding its infrastructure in the material sphere and its moral fiber in the sphere of ideas is equally alien. They believe in endless wars, and they are well funded by those who profit from those wars.
Yeah, it seems like there's always a boogeyman to be afraid of, that the neocons and the globalists try to sell the American public. We need to be scared of this, so we've got to take this action. Do you see the Russia phobia that kind of arose in 2016 after the election? Is that the same type of boogeyman that they've always been trying to push?
It is, except I would say that it is much older than 2016 or indeed the Ukrainian crisis of 2014. Among the neocons, Russophobia is a trademark which has been there almost as long as the movement has existed, which is partly due to the fact that Stalin's Soviet Union was perceived as the monstrous foe par excellence, both in their Trotskyite guise and later on in their newly fangled patriotic global imperialist guise. So without entering into the psychoanalytic overview of the collective memory of many members of the neoconservative cabal, suffice to say that their antagonism to Russia and all things Russians is visceral, that it is not subject to rational debate or analysis. And again, this is where they find themselves in agreement with the globalist left, which is Russophobic primarily because it sees Russia as the last bastion of traditional values in a major white Christian European nation. That, oddly enough, post-communist societies seem to have preserved their identity and their sense of rootedness far better than those which have been subjected to the quiet, slow erosion of liberal capitalism. Specifically, if we look at Germany today, what used to be West Germany is largely defanged. The denazification has resulted, especially among the young people, in de-Germanization. But if you look at the Länder, the provinces that belonged to the defunct German Democratic Republic, East Germany, Brandenburg, Saxony, Thuringia, and Pomerania, we see a far more diverse political spectrum there, instead of the middle of the road, soft left and soft right, social democrats, Christian democrats, and Greens. We see the serious polarization between the Linke, which is the party of the left, which is the heir to the old East German Communist Party, at one end of the spectrum, and we see the Alternative for Germany, AfD, on the other. we also see that the Visegrad Four, the four countries of Central Europe, which are resistant to the attempt by Brussels to impose compulsory quotas of migrants, which they would receive regardless of how their people feel about that. They're all former communist countries: Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. So while the neocons are antagonistic to Russia on emotional grounds, as well as because it is an obstacle to the full spectrum hegemony, the leftists want to finish Russia off because how dare they not have a gay parade in Moscow and no gays in Russian military, and why are the cross-gender bathrooms not an issue over which the Russian society will have a debate? Well, it is not, because it is a society which is still resistant to the virus of postmodern self-hate, which the postmodern leftists want to impose on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. The same process, sadly, is at work both in the US and Canada on the left side, and in Germany, Benelux, Scandinavia, France, Italy, and Britain on the right.
Is there a worldwide growing populist movement that you see as a threat to the neoconservatives?
I would like this to be the case. However, in Europe in particular, and I'm now talking more about Western Europe, we see a sustained and ruthless effort by the establishment to criminalize any manifestation of disagreement with the norms of political correctitude, which are then duly labeled xenophobia, Islamophobia, etc. In the United States, it takes an even more pernicious form, and it is for the companies which are nominally value neutral, IT giants, to adopt the role of the censors of public fora. So while it is obvious that social media are one way of bypassing the stranglehold that the globalist left has on the mainstream media, it is the greatest threat to the freedom of speech and freedom of communication today in the world, the way in which those who control the internet, or the most important manifestations of internet liberation we've seen over the past couple of decades, are now the ones who are deplatforming anyone they disagree with, or anyone their CEOs disagree with, or anyone who is in the crosshairs of the liberal leftist globalist mindset. In Germany, let me add, during the migrant wave of 2015, some professors did not get their contracts renewed if they dared express not disagreement, but simply doubt about the wisdom of Angela Merkel's open door policy. And on the subject of crimes committed by Muslim immigrants, you will be guilty of all sorts of unspeakable crimes if you dare say that there is some correlation between the epidemic of rapes in Norway and Sweden on the one hand, and the change of the ethno-religious map of those societies on the other. The obsession with concealing the names of culprits in various criminal cases has gone so far that it is openly verboten in the German press to name the culprits even after the sentences have been passed. This is a syndrome of a seriously sick society, and it is futile to expect that any form of neoconservative strain of thought, and there are some strain of thoughts that are somewhat different but not mutually incompatible, can help the healing process, because neoconservatism, just like globalism, is part of the problem. It represents the denial of authenticity in a nation and the attempt to postulate eternal war for eternally valid ideological principles as the grand strategy of a country. Now, in the United States would not avoid the destiny of other imperial projects in the past, which have invariably resulted in the destruction of the nation which embarked upon it. This was the case with Athens and Rome, neither of which have ever counted for much in world affairs after the Peloponnesian Wars in the Greek case, or after the fall of the Western Empire in the case of Rome. Look where is Spain today. It's a lovely country with charming people, excellent food and wine, but it's a middle of the road European minor power. It's a far cry from the greatest empire the world has ever seen at the time of Charles I and Philip II in the 16th century, and so on. So what always happens with imperial projects is that you reach the point of overreach, and there are challenges, rising powers who seek to challenge the status quo. And as Graham Allison rightly diagnosed in his excellent book, Destined for War, about the United States and China, I think it came out a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, whenever we have a challenger and a defender of the status quo, a war is very likely. Even though China, of course, has its temporary problems right now, there is no doubt that it is, globally speaking, a rising power, and that the United States, even with some solid economic short-term results that we've seen under Trump, is, globally speaking, a declining power. The US share of the world economy was 40% in 1960, and it's only about 20% now, one half of that. So the neocons have never adequately answered the question, since they also believe in the link between economic strength and military and political power. They do not believe in the national spirit and this mystical mumbo-jumbo of the Nazis, to their credit. They have never explained how do they expect the US to maintain ad infinitum, in perpetuity, this role of the benevolent global hegemon, quote unquote, with a relatively declining economic base vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Throughout human history, when you have a hegemon, you also have the spontaneous tendency of the weaker powers to find common ground. And at this moment in time, of course, it's Russia and China, the biggest country in the world in terms of territory and resources, and the most populous country in the world, and the most vigorous economy, finding both geopolitical and economic complementary elements for what is right now a partnership, but may yet turn into an alliance.
Let me ask you this. Who have been some of the most important voices opposing the neocon movement over the years?
Well, I would mention Pat Buchanan as the old and always eloquent, sometimes melancholy sounding voice of what is, again, commonly known as paleoconservatism, even though I don't like these shorthand terms and pigeonholing. And Paul Gottfried, and for instance, on Russophobia and the idiocy of treating Russia as an enemy, we have Stephen Cohen. And I think that a whole generation of writers on international affairs who follow the realist school, like John Mersheimer, are not explicitly naming the neoconservatives as their ideological foes, but are fundamentally opposed to them if you look at their core analysis, which boils down to the notion that national interests and not ideological constructs are the determining and should be the determining factors in foreign policy making, and that ultimately a national interest-based foreign policy is a moral foreign policy because it avoids the pitfalls of temptations of global hegemony. It is the real meaning of Trump's Make America Great Again. It's not a triumphalist cry of someone who wants to rule over the others in the name of America First. It's an appeal for America to come to her senses. And I don't know whether Trump has read the authors, but amazingly enough, in his 2016 campaign, particularly in the first debate with Hillary Clinton, he fairly accurately summarized what I would call the anti-neocon platform without even giving it an ideological label. It wasn't paleo. He's not a paleo. He's certainly, in terms of social policy and cultural values, not a paleo, but on foreign policy, he's what I would call an offensive realist. For instance, his strategy in dealing with Chinese tariffs last year was attacked from many sides for various reasons. In the end, it turns out that it worked because China at this moment in time does not want to force the issue with the United States. It is perfectly happy to make occasional concessions for as long as she husbands her resources for an eventual showdown which may come in 20 or 30 years' time, and then the playing field will be much more level than now.
Do you think a Hillary Clinton presidency would have furthered the neocon agenda much more than the Trump presidency has?
Undoubtedly, because what we are looking at is, again, liberalism on globalist steroids having no real difference in key determinants. Let us just remember the late unlamented John McCain, who was a never-Trumper to his last dying breath and even afterwards, and who never saw a war he didn't like. And Hillary Clinton, who, while Secretary of State, always treated military aggression as the instrument of first, not last resort. I'm thankful for Hillary Clinton's failure in November 2016, not only for a whole host of domestic reasons, but also for the fact that we have avoided at least 2, maybe 3 regional wars and possible escalation of confrontation with Russia beyond the point of no return. It doesn't mean that we can trust good luck forever. I think that if Trump wins in November, he should have a serious day of reckoning and purge of people like, I was frankly saddened to see the appointment of John Bolton as National Security Advisor, and as we witnessed last year, sooner or later, a person like that will start to advocate policies which are in line with his ideological preconceived notions, and not, as a national security advisor should do, present the president with a range of available options which are evaluated in terms of cost and benefit, in terms of furthering US security and well-being and prosperity. So we need the stables to be clear, the swamp to be dry. But of course, even within his team, we still have some who belong to that cabal and who are working within the upper middle levels of bureaucracy to continue guiding the ship of state in that direction. I can see it in the Balkans, where State Department officials still invariably support the revision of the Dayton Agreement, which partitioned Bosnia-Herzegovina into the Serbian Republic and the Muslim Croat Federation. And U.S. diplomats in Sarajevo consistently push for a more centralized, more unitary form of statehood, and even the abolition of the Dayton Agreement, for no better reason than that it is what they put as defined as their objective quarter of a century ago. And even though top decision makers in the White House and at Foggy Bottom may not even be aware of this, their officials on the ground, the bureaucrats, are still pushing more or less the same globalist, interventionist agenda in the Balkans that their democratic predecessors had pushed elsewhere with the Arab Spring and Obama's good war in Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's frustrating that you keep seeing these movements happening, and like there's the neocons somehow infiltrate so many levels of government, even when you think, well, with Trump elected, they're squashed, and they never are. How do they go about achieving this influence that they've had over the decades, and they still seem to have it?
Primarily by pretending that there's something they're not, i.e. that there is something conservative in their ideological package, and also by making themselves useful to the sources of funding. Because if you look at the think tanks and other institutions which push conservative agenda and which provide jobs and careers and lucrative contracts for people like Max Boot and Robert Kagan, it's really very hard to neutralize, because we are looking at very powerful corporations like Lockheed Martin, like Boeing, and we are looking at a well-oiled lobbying machine on K Street. Well, so for them to be defanged, it is important for at least next 4 years, if God willing Trump wins, to deny them the capacity to move from their sinecures into government. Because if they are not permanently, but at least excluded from positions of influence for a medium-term extended period of time, that will mean more for eliminating the virus than any piece of rhetoric you can think of. Like coronavirus, if it is subjected to temperature exceeding 22, 23 centigrade over a prolonged period of time, that's the end of it. Or if a droplet remains on the doorknob for a week, it is no longer dangerous. Likewise, if the neocons are kept out of any form of advisory or decision-making capacity in Trump 2's administration, I think it will be the long-desired stake through the heart. Or at least, the vampire will live forever, but at least you will deprive him of the access to the blood bank.
Excellent point. And well, let's hope that we can head in that direction. Before we get you out of here, is there anything you can direct my listeners to online where they can find your writings?
Yes, chroniclesmagazine.org has most of my recent blog articles and essays. And also, if you look at my YouTube clips, you will find a lot of stuff from RT, where I used to be a fairly regular guest until not so long ago. And I'm also available on Amazon.com, where you can get my book on Islam, The Sword of the Prophet. Even though it's out of print, there are lots of reserved copies available. and also my magnum opus, if that is the right word, because I believe, and we haven't had time to discuss this, that Islam as a global phenomenon and as a quasi-religious revolutionary doctrine in the long term still remains the main threat to our civilization, primarily because our civilization is demographically almost moribund, and the Islamic world is growing in an explosive way.
All right. Well, I will link to all of that in the show notes page for this episode. Serge, thank you so much for being here with us on Death to Tyrants.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that chat with Mr. Trifkovic. He, as you can tell, knows a lot about a lot, and I'm happy he gave us some of his time here on Death to Tyrants. If you're thinking about joining the Libertarian Party, I've got the link for you. www.lp.org/death2tyrants. If you'd like to find me on Facebook, facebook.com/death2tyrants podcast. Give me a follow on Twitter, twitter.com/buckrebel. And let's see. Oh, I've got a Patreon too. I don't like asking for money, but if you enjoy the show and you'd like to contribute, every last penny I earn from this account goes right into the show. It's patreon.com/death2tyrants. And until next week, you guys have a good one.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Death to Tyrants podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.